7 B-2 stealth bombers lifted off from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri and flew nonstop across the Atlantic, through the Mediterranean, and deep into the heart of the Middle East. They carried the most destructive conventional weapons ever built, and they dropped all of them in under 25 minutes. I'm Ryan, former F-15E combat pilot, former F-16 Thunderbird, current airline pilot, and I have spent my entire career thinking about exactly this kind of mission. Today, I'm going to break down what the United States military just did to Iran's underground bunker network, why it was one of the most consequential military operations in decades, and why the story is far from over. Here's the roadmap for today. First, I'm going to give you the strategic context. Why Iran built an underground nuclear network in the first place, and what problem it was designed to solve. Then, I'll walk you through Operation Midnight Hammer in detail, the assets, the sequencing, the weapon, and the targeting logic. After that, I'll give you the honest damage assessment, not the Pentagon press release version, the real one from the satellite imagery analysts. Then I'll walk you through what the battle damage revealed about the limits of our current capabilities. And finally, I'm going to tell you about a mountain called Pickaxe that has survived 2 wars untouched and is being actively hardened right now as you watch this video. Let's start with the context, because this did not happen overnight. For decades, Iran has been executing a very deliberate strategy. Bury your most sensitive facilities inside mountains, under hundreds of feet of solid rock, because no air force on the planet can reach you down there. That calculus worked for a very long time. Fordow, Iran's most hardened enrichment facility, was built into a mountain near Qom, roughly 160 kilometers south of Tehran. Intelligence estimates placed its centrifuge halls somewhere between 260 and 300 feet underground, inside solid limestone, reinforced, hardened, and specifically engineered to survive conventional airstrikes. Iran wasn't just hiding those facilities, they were making a statement. They were saying, "Come and get us." And for years, the honest answer from the Pentagon was that we couldn't. Not because we lacked the will, because we lacked the weapon. That changed on the night of June 21st, 2025. What followed would become the first combat use of the most powerful conventional bomb ever built, the culmination of 15 years of research and development, and the most significant American military strike against any nation since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Here is what Operation Midnight Hammer actually looked like. 7 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers departed Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, supported by more than 125 aircraft, F-22 Raptors and F-35 Lightning II flying ahead as high-altitude escorts, aerial refueling tankers keeping the package alive across thousands of miles, electronic warfare platforms suppressing Iranian air defenses, and a guided missile submarine that had been quietly pre-positioned in the region without anyone outside the command chain knowing it was there. All of that machinery converged on Iran in a single coordinated strike window. Over the course of approximately 25 minutes, 7 B-2 bombers dropped 14 GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator bombs across 2 target areas, 12 on Fordow, 2 on Natanz, while Tomahawk cruise missiles from that submarine struck the Isfahan nuclear facility simultaneously. 3 nuclear sites, 1 strike window, 25 minutes. General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, stood at a Pentagon podium after the mission and stated that all 3 sites had sustained what he called extremely severe damage and destruction, and that it was the first time in history those weapons had ever been used in a military operation. Now let me walk you through the targeting logic at Fordow specifically, because from a strike planning perspective, this is where it gets genuinely interesting. Fordow is not just a building buried underground. It is a facility built into the interior of a mountain, with the centrifuge enrichment halls located hundreds of feet below the summit. You cannot simply aim a bomb at the mountain and expect it to reach the target. The rock above acts as natural armor. The deeper the facility, the more protection the geology provides. The attack sequence the U.S. developed over years of planning was layered and deliberate. The first weapons in the sequence struck the reinforced concrete covers protecting Fordow's ventilation shafts, essentially blowing the caps off the 2 main access points into the facility's interior. Those ventilation shafts are a structural necessity. Any underground facility of that size needs airflow to operate, which means there have to be shafts connecting the surface to the buried chambers below. Those shafts became the attack vector. Once the concrete caps were destroyed by the first weapons, subsequent bombs threaded down through the exposed shafts and penetrated deep into the rock before detonating. 6 bombs down one shaft. 6 bombs down another. Each bomber carried what planners called a flex weapon, a backup MOP available for use in case of malfunction or the need for additional effect on target. That detail tells you something about how seriously the planners took the possibility of this not working on the first pass. Now let me talk about the weapon itself, because the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator is genuinely unlike anything that has ever been dropped in the history of aerial warfare. This bomb weighs 30,000 pounds. Sit with that number for a second. 30,000 pounds. That is not a weapon that fits on a fighter aircraft. It is so large and so heavy that only one aircraft in the world can carry it, the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, and each B-2 can carry exactly 2 of them. The warhead casing is machined from a specially engineered high-performance steel alloy. The design allows for a massive explosive payload while keeping the penetrator case structurally intact during the initial impact with reinforced concrete and rock, because if the casing fails or shatters on the surface, the weapon never reaches the target. It has to survive the impact before it can do its job. It is GPS guided. It can reportedly penetrate several hundred feet of Earth before detonating, and the Air Force has described it as capable of attacking targets that are deeply buried and hardened, in ways that nothing else in the conventional inventory can reach. And here's the part I want you to understand clearly. The GBU-57 was not developed as a general-purpose weapon. It was designed with one specific target requirement in mind: Fordow. The development timeline makes this undeniable. Construction on Fordow began around 2006 and 2007. In 2010, when the facility was nearing operational status, and U.S. intelligence had confirmed what Iran was building inside that mountain, the Air Force weapons development community was already describing the need for a new class of penetrating munition as an urgent priority. The Defense Threat Reduction Agency, working alongside Air Force weapons laboratories at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, spent the next 15 years modeling, testing, and validating the GBU-57 against simulated targets that replicated Fordow's depth and geology. 15 years of work, all of it aimed at one mountain in Iran. And on June 22nd, 2025, that weapon flew in combat for the first time in history. Now I want to give you the honest damage assessment, because the official statements and the independent analysis do not tell the same story. And I think you deserve both. Secretary Hegseth publicly stated that the operation had obliterated Iran's nuclear ambitions. Chairman Kane described the damage as extremely severe. The initial battle damage assessment from the Pentagon characterized all 3 sites as having sustained major destruction. Independent assessments from organizations like the Institute for Science and International Security, working from commercial satellite imagery taken in the weeks after the strike, paint a more nuanced picture, and I want to walk through each site. At Fordow, satellite imagery confirmed that Iran conducted what appeared to be damage assessments of the GBU-57 penetration holes located above both targeted ventilation shafts. The IAEA stated in its September 2025 verification report that the Fordow fuel enrichment plant was expected to have suffered very significant damage. The tunnel portal entrances were subsequently backfilled with soil. The site has remained largely dormant in imagery since then. I want to be clear that because Iran has barred IAEA inspectors from the site entirely since June 2025, the full assessment of what happened to the centrifuge halls underground remains, in part, unconfirmed. The IAEA is now working solely from satellite imagery. At Natanz, the satellite imagery showed at least one penetration hole above the buried enrichment hall, caused by the GBU-57 strike. Reports indicate the U.S. used what is known as a double-tap approach. 2 weapons potentially entering through the same penetration hole, one following the other to maximize depth and blast effect. The site was assessed as likely destroyed and knocked out of operation, with no repair activity visible in imagery as late as November 2025. The above-ground infrastructure connected to enrichment operations remained destroyed. The penetration hole was subsequently backfilled and capped. At Isfahan, the Tomahawk strikes destroyed the above-ground facilities, though Isfahan presented a different challenge and a different assessment. Independent analysts suggested that Natanz and Isfahan may recover faster than anticipated. The U.S. destroyed what was visible and reachable. What remained underground and intact is a harder question. Here's the number I want you to sit with for a moment. Approximately 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%, enough if further enriched for several nuclear devices, was assessed by Israeli intelligence to still be inside those 3 sites at the time of the strikes. That material was not removed before the attack. According to available intelligence, it has not been moved since. It may be buried under rubble. It may be degraded by the blasts, but it is not confirmed destroyed, and Iran has not allowed any independent verification of its status. That uncertainty is not a minor footnote. It is the central unresolved question of Operation Midnight Hammer, and it leads directly to the most important strategic lesson the Pentagon took from this mission. Here is the hard truth that the battle damage revealed. The GBU-57 can reportedly penetrate roughly 200 feet of Earth before detonating. Fordow's centrifuge halls sit between 260 and 300 feet underground. That gap, the distance between what the weapon can reach and the depth at which the target sits, is the core of the problem. The ventilation shaft approach was specifically designed to bridge that gap. By destroying the shaft caps and threading subsequent weapons down the exposed shafts, the planners were getting the explosive effect deeper into the facility than a direct surface strike could achieve. But even that approach has limits. And the independent assessments suggest that while the damage was severe, complete destruction of the buried enrichment infrastructure cannot be confirmed. Iran now knows this. They know exactly what the MOP can reach. They have measured the penetration holes. They have assessed the blast depths. They have spent the months since those strikes drawing a very specific set of conclusions about where the ceiling of American conventional capability sits. That knowledge is not sitting idle in Tehran. Within weeks of Operation Midnight Hammer, the U.S. Air Force Life Cycle Management Center at Eglin Air Force Base awarded a development contract to Applied Research Associates for the design and prototyping of a successor weapon to the GBU-57. It is designated the GBU-57 Next Generation Penetrator, or NGP. The contract was awarded on an expedited basis, without the standard competitive bidding process, which tells you everything about the urgency the Pentagon is attaching to this capability gap. I want to be completely clear that the NGP is not a fielded weapon. This is a development and prototyping contract. The weapon does not yet exist in deployable form. That matters enormously when you understand what Iran is building right now. Which brings me to Pickaxe Mountain, and I need you to understand why this matters. The formal designation is Ku-e-Kolangaz La, Pickaxe Mountain in Farsi, and it sits approximately 2 kilometers south of the Natanz nuclear complex in central Iran. Iran has officially described it as a centrifuge assembly plant. The IAEA has never been granted access to verify that claim. International inspectors have never set foot inside it. Construction on this facility began around 2020. Notably, almost immediately after a centrifuge production plant at Natanz was destroyed in a sabotage operation widely attributed to Israel in July of that year. The timing is not a coincidence. Iran watched Natanz get hit from the inside, drew the appropriate conclusion about what above-ground and shallowly buried facilities could survive, and began building something specifically designed to defeat the next level of attack. Here's what the satellite imagery and independent analysis tells us about Pickaxe Mountain. The underground halls are estimated to be buried somewhere between 78 and 145 meters below the mountain's summit, depending on which assessment methodology you use and what assumptions you make about the tunnel angles. Some independent researchers place the facility depth at approximately 100 meters, roughly 328 feet. There are assessments that suggest it could be even deeper. By comparison, Fordow sits at 80 to 90 meters underground. Pickaxe Mountain is deeper. It is built into harder granite geology rather than limestone. A senior Iranian regime advisor publicly described it as, and I want to quote this directly, the most fortified nuclear facility in the world, and stated that striking it would turn the entire region into hell. I will let you assess that statement for what it is. Pickaxe Mountain was not struck in Operation Midnight Hammer. It was not struck in the round of fighting that began in February 2026. It has survived 2 separate conflicts without being targeted once, aside from the reported destruction of a single vehicle on a nearby spoil pile. As of the most recent satellite imagery available, construction is continuing. Concrete is being poured over tunnel entrances. Rock is being leveled and compacted over portal access points. Iran is not slowing down. They are hardening and they are finishing. And based on the available assessments, the Pickaxe Mountain facility is not yet operational, but it is getting closer. On July 13, 2026, President Trump addressed this directly in an interview. He stated that the United States has eyes on Pickaxe Mountain, described it as a potential target for what he called a nice big fat shot right in the front door, and closed with the statement, "We're going to take out Pickaxe Mountain. Tell the Iranians to be ready." Let me give you the professional read on what a strike against Pickaxe Mountain would actually require, because this is where the operational reality gets complicated. The first challenge is the targeting problem. At Fordow, 15 years of intelligence work had produced detailed schematics of the facility's interior. The locations of the ventilation shafts, the angles at which they descended into the mountain, the depth of the centrifuge halls relative to the surface. That intelligence picture took over a decade to build and was the foundation of the entire strike plan. Schematics for Pickaxe Mountain have not been seen publicly. Analysts believe the same ventilation shaft approach that was used at Fordow is likely the attack vector for any strike on Pickaxe, because ventilation is a physical necessity that cannot be engineered away. But the shaft locations, depths, and angles at Pickaxe Mountain are not confirmed in open source reporting. That intelligence gap is not a minor planning problem. It is the difference between a strike that works and one that doesn't. The second challenge is the depth problem. At 100 meters or deeper, Pickaxe Mountain may sit at or below the effective engagement threshold of the current GBU-57 inventory, depending on the geology and the specific shaft geometry. The ventilation shaft approach extended the effective reach of the MOP at Fordow. Whether the same geometry exists at Pickaxe, and whether the current weapon can exploit it the same way, is not publicly confirmed. The NGP, the Next Generation Penetrator currently in development, is presumably being designed to close this gap, but the NGP is not fielded yet. It exists as a development contract. which means the United States is currently in a window where our most capable conventional bunker-busting weapon may not be sufficient against the most hardened target Iran has ever built, and the weapon designed to replace it is still on the drawing board. That window has strategic implications that I do not think are getting the attention they deserve. There is a significant difference between striking Pickaxe Mountain before it becomes operational and striking it after Iran has loaded it with centrifuges and enriched uranium. Before it goes operational, you're hitting tunnels and empty halls. After it goes operational, you're dealing with all of the same uncertainties we have now about the material sitting inside Fordow and Isfahan. Unconfirmed status, blocked inspectors, buried stockpiles. The pressure to strike before that window closes is real, and the weapon designed to do it cleanly does not yet exist. I also want to flag one additional layer of this problem that has not gotten enough coverage. Analysts believe that more than half of Iran's remaining stockpile of uranium enriched to 60% may currently be hidden at Isfahan, underground, in tunnels, beneath a facility that was struck by tomahawks in 2025, but whose underground infrastructure was not fully destroyed. If Iran has been using the months since the ceasefire to relocate enriched material from damaged sites into Pickaxe Mountain, and given the active construction hardening the tunnel entrances, that possibility cannot be dismissed. Then any strike on Pickaxe becomes simultaneously more urgent and more consequential. You are not just hitting a facility that might have centrifuges. You might be hitting the facility where Iran has consolidated everything it salvaged from 3 wars. Here is where I will give you my bottom line assessment. Operation Midnight Hammer was a historic military achievement. 7 B-2 bombers flying nonstop from Missouri to Iran. A 125 aircraft strike package coordinating across multiple domains simultaneously. The first combat employment of the most powerful conventional bomb ever built. Severe and real damage to Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. These are facts, and the people who planned and executed that mission deserve full credit for what they pulled off. But severely damaged and finished are not the same thing. The enriched uranium stockpile remains unconfirmed, destroyed. The IAEA is locked out. Iran has drawn the lessons and is actively building a deeper, harder, more fortified successor to everything we struck. Pickaxe Mountain has survived 2 wars untouched, and the weapon designed to defeat it at full depth does not yet exist in fielded form. The United States military did not end the underground bunker problem on June 22, 2025. It exposed the next generation of it, and the next chapter of this story is going to be defined by whether the NGP gets fielded before Pickaxe Mountain becomes operational, or whether we find ourselves back at the same table, trying to figure out how to reach something buried deeper than anything we have ever successfully hit before. That is the race that is happening right now quietly, while most people are focused on the ceasefire lines and the diplomatic noise. The bunkers are getting deeper, the weapons are getting better, and the window to act before those 2 trajectories cross is narrowing every single day. If you want me to go deep on the GBU-57 Next Generation Penetrator, what we know about the weapon being developed right now, what it would need to defeat Pickaxe Mountain, and what the timeline looks like, drop NGP in the comments below. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe. I cover military aviation and geopolitics from the perspective of someone who has actually planned these kinds of missions, and we are nowhere near done with this story.